Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. This is episode 19, book 2, and I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Maida goes to her first ever Halloween party, but she has even more fun when it snows and she learns to coast down hills and build a very funny snowman. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Maida's Little Shop, Chapter 11, Halloween. Halloween fell on Saturday that year. That made Friday a very busy time for Maida and the other members of the WMNT. In the afternoon they all worked like beavers, making jack-o'-lanterns of the dozen pumpkins that Granny had ordered. Maida and Rosie and Dickie hollowed and scraped them. Arthur did all the hard work, the cutting out of the features, the putting in of candle holders. These pumpkin lanterns were for decoration, but Maida had ordered many paper jack-o'-lanterns for sale. The WMNTs spent the evening rearranging the shop. Maida went to bed so tired that she could hardly drag one foot after the other. Granny had to undress her. But when the school children came flocking in the next morning, she felt more than repaid for her work. The shop resounded with the "Oh my's" and "Oh looks" of their surprise and delight. Indeed, the room seemed full of twinkling yellow faces. Lines of them grinned in the doorway. Rows of them smirked from the shelves. A frieze, close set as peas in a pod, grimaced from the molding. The jolly-looking pumpkin jacks that Arthur had made were piled in a pyramid in the window. The biggest of them all, "He looks just like the man in the moon," Rosie said, smiled benignantly at the passers-by from the top of the heap. Standing about everywhere among the lanterns were groups of little paper brownies. Their tiny heads turned upwards as if, in the greatest astonishment, they were examining these monster beings. The jack-o'-lanterns sold like hotcakes. As for the brownies, "Granny, you'd think they were marching off the shelves," Maida said. By dark she was diving breathlessly into her surplus stock. At the first touch of twilight, she lighted every lantern left in the place. 5 minutes afterwards, a crowd of children had gathered to gaze at the flaming faces in the window. Even the grown-ups stopped to admire the effect. More customers came and more. A great many children whom Maida had never seen before. By 6 o'clock, she had sold out her entire stock. When she sat down to dinner that night, she was a very happy little girl. "This is the best day I've had since I opened the shop," she said contentedly. She was not tired, though. "I feel just like going to a party tonight. Granny, can I wear my prettiest Roman sash?" "You can wear anything you want, my lamb," Granny said, "for 'tis the good, busy little child you've been this day." Granny dressed her according to Maida's choice in white. A very simple, soft little frock it was, with many tiny tucks made by hand, and many insertions of a beautiful fine lace. Maida chose to wear it with pale blue silk stockings and slippers, a sash of blue, striped in pink and white, and a string of pink Venetian beads. "Now, Granny, I'll read until the children call for me," she suggested, "so I won't rumple my dress." But she was too excited to read. She sat for a long time at the window, just looking out. Presently the jack-o'-lanterns, lighted now, began to make blobs of gold in the furry darkness of the street. She could not at first make out who held them. It was strange to watch the fiery, grinning heads flying bodiless from place to place, but she identified the lanterns in the court by the houses from which they emerged. The 3 small ones on the end at the left meant Dickie and Molly and Tim. 2 big ones, mounted on sticks, came from across the way. Rosie and Arthur, of course. 2 just alike, trotting side by side, betrayed the Clark twins. A baby lantern, swinging close to the ground, That could be nobody but Betsy. The crowd in the court began to march toward the shop. For an instant, Maida watched the spots of brilliant color dancing in her direction. Then she slipped into her coat and seized her own lantern. When she came outside, the sidewalk seemed crowded with grotesque faces, all laughing at her. "Just think," she said, "I have never been to a Halloween party in my life." "You are the queerest thing, Maida," Rosie said in perplexity. "You've been to Europe. You can talk French and Italian. And yet you've never been to a Halloween party. Did you ever hang May baskets?" Maida shook her head. "You wait until next May," Rosie prophesied. The crowd crossed over into the court. Two motionless yellow faces grinning at them from the Lathrop steps showed that Laura and Harold had come out to meet them. On the lawn they broke into an impromptu game of tag, which the jack-o'-lanterns seemed to enjoy as much as the children. Certainly they whizzed from place to place as quickly, and certainly they smiled as hard. The game ended. They left their lanterns on the piazza and trooped into the house. "We've got to play the first games in the kitchen," Laura announced after the coats and hats had come off, and Mrs. Lathrop had greeted them all. Maida wondered what sort of party it was that was held in the kitchen, but she asked no questions. Almost bursting with curiosity, she joined the long line, marching to the back of the house. In the middle of the kitchen floor stood a tub of water, with apples floating in it. "Bobbing for apples!" the children exclaimed. "Oh, that's the greatest fun of all. Did you ever bob for apples, Maida?" "No." "Let Maida try it first, then," Laura said. "It's very easy, Maida," she went on with twinkling eyes. "All you have to do is kneel on the floor, clasp your hands behind you, and pick out one of the apples with your teeth. You'll each be allowed 3 minutes." "Oh, I can get half a dozen in 3 minutes, I guess," Maida said. Laura tied a big apron around Maida's waist and stood, watch in hand. The children gathered in a circle about the tub. Maida knelt on the floor, clasped her hands behind her, and reached with a wide-open mouth for the nearest apple. But at the first touch of her lips, the apple bobbed away. She reached for another. That bobbed away too, and another, and another, and another. They all bobbed clean out of her reach, no matter how delicately she touched them. That method was unsuccessful. "1 minute," called Laura. Maida could hear the children giggling at her. She tried another scheme, making vicious little dabs at the apples. Her beads and her hair ribbon and one of her long curls dipped into the water. But she only succeeded in sending the apples across the tub. 2 minutes, called Laura. "Why don't you get those half a dozen?" the children jeered. "You know you said it was so easy." Maida giggled too, but inwardly she made up her mind that she would get one of those apples if she dipped her whole head into the tub. At last, a brilliant idea occurred to her. Using her chin as a guide, she poked a big rosy apple over against the side of the tub. Wedging it there against another big apple, she held it tight. Then she dropped her head a little, gave a sudden big bite, and arose amidst applause, with the apple secure between her teeth. After that, she had the fun of watching the other children. The older ones were adepts. In 3 minutes, Rosie secured 4, Dickie 5, and Arthur 6. Rosie did not get a drop of water on her, but the boys emerged with dripping heads. The little children were not very successful, but they were much more fun. Molly swallowed so much water that she choked and had to be patted on the back. Betsy, after a few snaps of her little rosebud mouth, seized one of the apples with her hand, sat down on the floor, and calmly ate it. But the climax was reached when Timmy Doyle suddenly lurched forward and fell headlong into the tub. "I knew he'd fall in," Molly said in a matter-of-fact voice. "He always falls into everything. I brought a dry set of clothes for him. Come, Tim." At this announcement, everybody shrieked. Molly disappeared with Tim in the direction of Laura's bedroom. When she reappeared, sure enough, Tim had a dry suit on. Next, Laura ordered them to sit about the kitchen table. She gave each child an apple and a knife, and directed him to pare the apple without breaking the peel. If you think that is an easy thing to do, try it. It seemed to Maida that she would never accomplish it. She spoiled 3 apples before she succeeded. "Now take your apple paring "And form a line across the kitchen floor," Laura commanded. The flock scampered to obey her. "Now, when I say 3, she continued, "throw the parings back over your shoulder to the floor. If the paring makes a letter, it will be the initial of your future husband or wife. 1, 2, 3! A dozen apple parings flew to the floor. Everybody raced across the room to examine the results. "Mine is B," Dickie said. "And mine's an O," Rosie declared. "As plain as anything. What's yours, Maida?" "It's an X," Maida answered in great perplexity. "I don't believe that there are any names beginning with X except maybe Xenophon and Xerxes." "Well, mine's as bad," Laura laughed. "It's a Z. I guess I'll be Mrs. Zero." "That's nothing," Arthur laughed. "Mine's an ampersand. I can't marry anybody named And." "Well, if that isn't successful," Laura said, "there's another way of finding out who your husband or wife's going to be. You must walk down the cellar backwards with a candle in one hand and a mirror in the other. You must look in the mirror all the time, and when you get to the foot of the stairs, you will see reflected in it the face of your husband or wife." This did not interest the little children, but the big ones were wild to try it. "Gracious, doesn't it sound scary?" Rosie said, her great eyes snapping. "I love a game that's kind of spooky, don't you, Maida?" Maida did not answer. She was watching Harold, who was sneaking out of the room very quietly from a door at the side. "All right then, Rosie," Laura caught her up. "You can go first." The children all crowded over to the door leading to the cellar. The stairs were as dark as pitch. Rosie took the mirror and the candle that Laura handed her and slipped through the opening. The little audience listened, breathless. They heard Rosie stumble awkwardly down the stairs, heard her pause at the foot. Next came a moment of silence, of waiting as tense above as below. Then came a burst of Rosie's jolly laughter. She came running up to them, her cheeks like roses, her eyes like stars. They crowded around her. "What did you see? Tell us about it," they clamored. Rosie shook her head. "No, no, no," she maintained. "I'm not going to tell you what I saw till you've been down yourself." It was Arthur's turn next. They listened again. The same thing happened. Awkward stumbling down the stairs. A pause. Then a roar of laughter. "Oh, what did you see?" they implored when he reappeared. "Try it yourself," he advised. "I'm not going to tell." Dickie went next. Again they all listened, and to the same mysterious doings. Dickie came back smiling, but like the others, he refused to describe his experiences. Now it was Maida's turn. She took the candle and the mirror from Dickie and plunged into the shivery darkness of the stairs. It was doubly difficult for her to go down backward because of her lameness, but she finally arrived at the bottom and stood there expectantly. It seemed a long time before anything happened. Suddenly, she felt something stir back of her. A lighted jack-o'-lantern came from between the folds of a curtain which hung from the ceiling. It grinned over her shoulder at her face in the mirror. Maida burst into a shriek of laughter and scrambled upstairs. "I'm going to marry a jack-o'-lantern," she said. "My name's going to be Mrs. Jack Pumpkin." "I'm going to marry Laura's sailor doll," Rosie confessed. "My name is Mrs. Yankee Doodle." "I'm going to marry Laura's big doll Queenie," Arthur admitted. "And I'm going to marry Harold's teddy bear," Dickie said. After that, they blew soap bubbles and roasted apples and chestnuts, popped corn and pulled candy at the great fireplace in the playroom. And at Maida's request, just before they left, Laura danced for them. "Will you help me to get my costume on, Maida?" Laura asked. "Of course," Maida said, wondering. "I asked you to come down here, Maida," Laura said when the 2 little girls were alone, "because I wanted to tell you that I am so sorry for the way I treated you just before I got diphtheria. I told my mother about it, and she said I did those things because I was coming down sick. She said that people are always fretty and cross when they're not well, but I don't think it was that at all. I guess I did it on purpose just to be disagreeable. But I hope you will excuse me." "Of course I will, Laura," Maida said heartily, "and I hope you will forgive me for going so long without speaking to you. But you see, I heard—" She stopped and hesitated. Things, she ended lamely. Oh, I know what you heard. I said those things about you to the WMNTs so that they'd get back to you. I wanted to hurt your feelings. Laura in her turn stopped and hesitated for an instant. I was jealous, she finally confessed in a burst. But I want you to understand this, Maida. I didn't believe those horrid things myself. I always have a feeling inside when people are telling lies, and I didn't have that feeling when you were talking to me. I knew that you were telling the truth, and all the time while I was getting well, I felt so dreadfully about it that I knew I would never be happy again unless I told you so. I did feel bad when I heard those things, Maida said, but of course I forgot about them when Rosie told me you were ill. Let's forget all about it again. But Maida told the WMNTs something of her talk with Laura, and the result was an invitation to Laura to join the club. It was accepted gratefully. The next month went by on wings. It was a busy month, although in a way it was an uneventful one. The weather kept clear and fine. Little rain fell, but on the other hand, to the great disappointment of the little people of Primrose Court, there was no snow. Maida saw nothing of her father, for business troubles kept him in New York. He wrote constantly to her, though, and she wrote as faithfully to him. Letters could not quite fill the gap that his absence made. Perhaps Billy suspected Maida's secret loneliness, for he came oftener and oftener to see her. One night, the WMNTs begged so hard for a story that he finally began one called The Crystal Ball. A wonderful thing about it was that it was half game and half story. Most wonderful of all, it went on from night to night, and never showed any signs of coming to an end. But in order to play this game story, there were 2 or 3 conditions to which you must absolutely submit. For instance, it must always be played in the dark. And first, everybody must shut his eyes tight. Billy would say in a deep voice, "Abracadabra!" And presto! There they all were, Maida, Rosie, Laura, Billy, Arthur, and Dickie, inside the crystal ball. What people lived there and what things happened to them cannot be told here, but after an hour or more, Billy's deepest voice would boom, "Abracadabra!" again, and presto! There they were all again, back in the cheerful living room. Maida hoped against hope that her father would come to spend Thanksgiving with her, but that, he wrote finally, was impossible. Billy came, however, and they 3 enjoyed one of Granny's delicious turkey dinners. "I hoped that I would have found your daughter Annie by this time, Granny," Billy said. "I ask every Irishman I meet if he came from Aldegarry, County Sligo, or if he knows anybody who did, or if he's ever met a pretty Irish girl by the name of Annie Flynn. But I'll find her yet, you'll see." "I hope so, Mr. Billy," Granny said respectfully. But Maida thought her voice sounded as if she had no great hope. Dickie still continued to come for his reading lessons, although Maida could see that in a month or 2 he would not need a teacher. The quiet, studious, pale little boy had become a great favourite with Granny Flynn. "Sure, and I must be after getting over to see the poor lad's mother some night," she said. "'Tis a nice woman she must be with such a pretty behaved little lad." "Oh, she is, Granny," Maida said earnestly. "I've been there once or twice when Mrs. Dorr came home early, and she's just the nicest lady and so fond of Dickie and the baby." But Granny was old and very easily tired, and so, though her intentions were of the best, she did not make this call. One afternoon, after Thanksgiving, Maida ran over to Dickie's to borrow some pink tissue paper. She knocked gently. Nobody answered, but from the room came the sound of sobbing. Maida listened. It was Dickie's voice. At first, she did not know what to do. Finally, she opened the door and peeped in. Dickie was sitting all crumpled up, his head resting on the table. "Oh, what is the matter, Dickie?" Maida asked. Dickie jumped. He raised his head and looked at her. His face was swollen with crying, his eyes red and heavy. For a moment he could not speak. Maida could see that he was ashamed of being caught in tears, that he was trying hard to control himself. "It's something I heard," he replied at last. "What?" Maida asked. Last night, after I got to bed, Doc O'Brien came here to get his bill paid. Mother thought I was asleep and asked him a whole lot of questions. He told her that I wasn't any better, and I never would be any better. He said I'd be a cripple for the rest of my life. In spite of all his efforts, Dickie's voice broke into a sob. "Oh, Dickie, Dickie," Maida said. Better than anybody else in the world, Maida felt that she could understand, could sympathize. "Oh, Dickie, how sorry I am." "I can't bear it," Dickie said, put his head down on the table and began to sob. "I can't bear it," he said. "Why, I thought when I grew up to be a man, I was going to take care of Mother and Delia. Instead of that, they'll be taking care of me. What can a cripple do?" "Once I read about a crippled newsboy. Do you suppose I could sell newspapers?" he asked, with a gleam of hope. "I'm sure you could," Maida said heartily, "and a great many other things. But it may not be as bad as you think, Dickie. Dr. O'Brien may be mistaken. You know something was wrong with me when I was born, and I did not begin to walk until a year ago. My father has taken me to so many doctors that I'm sure he could not remember half their names, but they all said the same thing, that I would never walk like other children. Then a very great physician, Dr. Grindschmidt, came from away across the sea, from Germany. He said he could cure me, and he did. I had to be operated on, and, oh, I suffered dreadfully. But you see that I'm all well now. I'm even losing my limp. Now I believe that Dr. Grindschmidt can cure you. The next time my father comes home, I'm going to ask him." Dickie had stopped crying. He was drinking down everything that she said. "Is he still here? That doctor?" he said. "No," Maida admitted sorrowfully. "But there must be doctors as good as he somewhere. But don't you worry about it at all, Dickie. You wait until my father sees you. He always gets everything made right." "When's your father coming home?" "I don't quite know, but I look for him any time now." Dickie started to set the table. "I guess I wouldn't have cried," he said after a while, "if I could have cried last night when I first heard it, but of course I couldn't let my mother or Doc O'Brien know that I'd heard them. It would make them feel bad. I don't want my mother ever to know that I know it." After that, Maida redoubled her efforts to be nice to Dickie. She cudgeled her brains, too, for new decorative schemes for his paperwork. She asked Billy Potter to bring a whole bag of her books from the Beacon Street house, and she lent them to Dickie, a half-dozen at a time. Indeed, they were a very busy quartet, the WMNTs. Rosie went to school every day. She climbed out of her window no more at night. She seemed to prefer helping Maida in the shop to anything else. Arthur Duncan was equally industrious. With no Rosie to play hooky with, he too was driven to attending school regularly. His leisure hours were devoted to whittling and wood carving. He was always doing kind things for Maida and Granny, bringing up the coal, emptying the ashes, running errands. And so November passed into December. Chapter 12. The First Snow. "Look out the window, my lamb," Granny called one morning early in December. Maida opened her eyes, jumped obediently out of bed, and pattered across the room. There she gave a scream of delight, jumping up and down and clapping her hands. "Snow! Oh, goody, 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 snow at last!" It looked as if the whole world had been wrapped in a blanket of the whitest, fleeciest, shiningest wool. Sidewalks, streets, crossings were all leveled to one smoothness. The fences were so muffled that they had swelled to twice their size. The houses wore trim, pointy caps on their gables. The high bushes in the yard hung to the very ground. The low ones had become mounds. The trees looked as if they had been packed in cotton wool and put away for the winter. "And the lovely part of it is, it's still snowing," Maida exclaimed blissfully. "Glory be, it'll be a blizzard before we're through with it," Granny said and shivered. Maida dressed in the greatest excitement. Few children came in to make purchases that morning, and the lines pouring into the schoolhouse were very shivery and much shorter than usual. At 11:45, the 1 session bell rang. When the children came out of school at 1, the snow was whirling down thicker and faster than in the morning. A high wind came up and piled it in the most unexpected places. Trade stopped entirely in the shop. No mother would let her children brave so terrific a storm. It snowed that night, and all the next morning. The second day, fewer children went to school than on the first. But at 2 o'clock, when the sun burst through the gray sky, the children swarmed the streets. Shovels and brooms began to appear, snowballs to fly, sleigh bells to tinkle. Rosie came dashing into the shop in the midst of this burst of excitement. "I've shoveled our sidewalk," she announced triumphantly. "Is anything wrong with me? Everybody's staring at me." Maida stared too. Rosie's scarlet cape was dotted with snow. Her scarlet hat was white with it. Great flakes had caught in her long black hair and starred her soft brows. They hung from her very eyelashes. Her cheeks and lips were the color of coral, and her eyes like great velvety moons. "You look in the glass and see what they're staring at," Maida said slyly. Rosie went to the mirror. "I don't see anything's the matter." "It's because you look so pretty, goose," Maida exclaimed. Rosie always blushed and looked ashamed if anybody alluded to her prettiness. Now she leaped to Maida's side and pretended to beat her. "Stop that!" a voice called. Startled, the little girls looked up. Billy stood in the doorway. "I've come over to make a snow house," he explained. "Oh, Billy, what things you do think of," Maida exclaimed. "Wait till I get Arthur and Dickie." "Couldn't get many more in here, could we?" Billy commented when the 5 had assembled in the child-size yard. "I don't know that we could stow away another shovel. Now, first of all, you're to pile all the snow in the yard into that corner." Everybody went to work, but Billy and Arthur moved so quickly with their big shovels that Maida and Rosie and Dickie did nothing but hop about them. Almost before they realized it, the snow pile reached to the top of the fence. "Pack it down hard," Billy commanded, "as hard as you can make it." Everybody scrambled to obey. For a few moments, the sound of shovels beating on the snow drowned their talk. "That will do for now," Billy commanded suddenly. His little force stopped, breathless and red-cheeked. "Now I'm going to dig out the room. I guess I'll have to do that. If you're not careful enough, the roof will cave in. Then it's all got to be done again." Working very slowly, he began to hollow out the structure. After the hole had grown big enough, he crawled into it. But in spite of his own warning, he must have been too energetic in his movements. Suddenly, the roof came down on his head. Billy was on his feet in an instant, shaking the snow off as a dog shakes off water. "Why, Billy, you look like a snowman," Maida laughed. "I feel like one," Billy said, wiping the snow from his eyes and from under his collar. "But don't be discouraged, my hearties. Up with it again. I'll be more careful the next time." They went at it again, with increased interest, heaping up a mound of snow, bigger than before, beating it until it was as hard as a brick, hollowing out inside a chamber big enough for 3 of them to occupy at once. But Billy gave them no time to enjoy their new dwelling. "Run into the house," was his next order, "and bring out all the water you can carry." There was a wild scramble to see who would get to the sink first, but in a few moments an orderly file emerged from the house. Arthur with a bucket, Dickie with a basin, Rosie with a dishpan, Maida with a dipper. "Now I'm going to pour water all over the house," Billy explained. "You see, if it freezes now, it will last longer." Very carefully he sprayed it on the sides and the roof, dashing it upward on the inside walls. "We might as well make it look pretty while we're about it," Billy continued. "You children get to work and make a lot of snowballs the size of an orange, and just as round as you can turn them out." This was easy work. Before Billy could say Jack Robinson, 4 pairs of eager hands had accumulated snowballs enough for a sham battle. In the meantime, Billy had decorated the doorway with 2 round, tall pillars. He added a pointed roof to the house and trimmed it with snowballs all along the edge. "Now I guess we better have a snowman to live in this mansion while we're about it," Billy suggested. "Each of you, roll up an arm or a leg while I make the body." Billy placed the legs in the corner opposite the snow house. He lifted onto them the big round body which he himself had rolled. Putting the arms on was not so easy. He worked for a long time before he found the angle at which they would stick. Everybody took a hand at the head. Maida contributed some dults for the hair, slitting it into ribbons which she stuck on with glue. Rosie found a broken clothespin for the nose. The round, smooth coals that Dickie discovered in the coal hod made a pair of expressive black eyes. Arthur cut 2 sets of teeth from orange peel and inserted them in the gash that was the mouth. When the head was set on the shoulders, Billy disappeared into the house for a moment, came back carrying a suitcase. "Shut your eyes, every man jack of you," he ordered. "You're not to see what I do until it's done. If I catch one of you peeking, I'll confine you in the snow house for 5 minutes. The WMNTs shut their eyes tight and held down the lids with resolute fingers, but they kept their ears wide open. The mysterious work on which Billy was engaged was accompanied by the most tantalizing noises. "Oh, Billy, can't I please look?" Maida begged, jiggling up and down. "I can't stand it much longer." "In a minute," Billy said encouragingly. The mysterious noises kept up. "Now," Billy said suddenly. 4 pairs of eyes leaped open. 4 pairs of lips shrieked their delight. Indeed, Maida and Rosie laughed so hard that they finally rolled in the snow. Billy had put an old coat on the snowman's body. He had put a tall hat, Arthur called it a stovepipe, on the snowman's head. He had put an old black pipe between the snowman's grinning orange-colored teeth. Gloves hung limply from the snowman's arm stumps, and to one of them a cane was fastened. Billy had managed to give the snowman's head a cock to one side. Altogether he looked so spruce and jovial that it was impossible not to like him. "Mr. Chumpley, ladies and gentlemen," Billy said. "Some members of the WMNT, Mr. Chumpley." And Mr. Chumpley he was. Billy stayed that night to dinner. They had just finished eating when an excited ring of the bell announced Rosie. "Oh, Granny," she said, "the boys have made a most wonderful coast down Hollywell Street, and Aunt Teresa says I can go coasting until 9 o'clock. If you'll let Maida go too. I thought maybe you would, especially if Billy comes along." "If Mr. Billy goes, 'twill be all right." "Oh, Granny," Maida said, "you dear, darling old fairy dame." She was so excited that she wiggled like an eel all the time Granny was bundling her into her clothes. And when she reached the street, it seemed as if she must explode. A big moon, floating like a silver balloon in the sky, made the night like day. The neighborhood sizzled with excitement, for the street and sidewalks were covered with children dragging sleds. "It's like the Pied Piper, Rosie," Maida said joyfully. "Children everywhere and all going in the same direction." They followed the procession up Warrington Street to where Hollywell Street sloped down the hill. Billy let out a long whistle of astonishment. "Great Scott, what a coast!" he said. In the middle of the street was a ribbon of ice, 3 feet wide and as smooth as glass. At the foot of the hill, a piled-up mound of snow served as a buffer. "The boys have been working on the slide all day," Rosie said. "Did you ever see such a nice one, Maida?" "I never saw any kind of a one," Maida confessed. "How did they make it so smooth?" "Pouring water on it." "Have you never coasted before, Maida?" Billy asked. "Never." "Well, here's your chance, then," said a cheerful voice back of them. They all turned. There stood Arthur Duncan, with what Maida soon learned was a double runner. Billy examined it carefully. "Did you make it, Arthur?" "Yes." "Pretty good piece of work," Billy commented. "Want to try it, Maida?" "I'm crazy to." "All right. Pile on." Arthur took his place in front. Rosie sat next, then Dickie, then Maida, then Billy. "Hold on to Dickie," Billy instructed Maida, "and I'll hold on to you." Tingling with excitement, Maida did as she was told, but it seemed as if they would never start. But at last she heard Billy's voice. "On your marks. Get set. Go!" The double runner stirred. It moved slowly for a moment across the level top of the street. Then came the first slope of the hill. They plunged forward. She heard Rosie's hysterical shriek, Dickie's vociferous cheers, and Billy's blood-curdling yells. But she herself was as silent as a little image. They struck the second slope of the hill. Then she screamed too. The houses on either side shot past like pictures in a kinetoscope. She felt a rush of wind that must surely blow her ears off. They reached the third slope of the hill, and now they had left the earth and were sailing through the air. The next instant, the double runner had come to rest on the bank of snow, and Rosie and she were hugging each other and saying, "Wasn't it great?" They climbed to the top of the hill again. All the way back, Maida watched the sleds whizzing down the coast. Boys alone on sleds, girls alone on sleds, pairs of girls, pairs of boys, one seated in front, the other steering with a foot that trailed behind on the ice. Timid little girls who did not dare the ice but contented themselves with sliding on the snow at either side. Daring little boys who went down lying flat on their sleds. At the top they were besieged with entreaties to go on the double runner. And as there was room enough for one more, they took a little boy or girl with them each time. Rosie lent her sled to those who had none. At first there were plenty of these standing at the top of the coast, wistfully watching the fun of more fortunate children. But after a while it was discovered that the ice was so smooth that almost anything could be used for coasting. The sledless ones rushed home and reappeared with all kinds of things. One little lad went down on a shovel, and his intrepid little sister followed on a broom. Boxes and shingles and even dishpans began to appear. Most reckless of all, one big fellow slid down on his 2 feet, landing in a heap in the snow. Maida enjoyed every moment of it, even the long walks back up the hill. Once the double runner struck into a riderless sled that had drifted onto the course and was overturned immediately. Nobody was hurt. Rosie, Dickie, and Arthur were cast safely to one side in the soft snow, but Maida and Billy were thrown whirling onto the ice. Billy kept his grip on Maida, and they shot down the hill, turning round and round and round. At first, Maida was a little frightened, but when she saw that they were perfectly safe, that Billy was making her spin about in that ridiculous fashion, she laughed so hard that she was weak when they reached the bottom. "Oh, let's do that again," she said when she caught her breath. Never was such a week as followed. The cold weather kept up. Continued storms added to the snow. For the first time in years came 4 one-session days in a single week. It seemed as if Jack Frost were on the side of the children. He would send violent flurries of snow just before the one-session bell rang. But as soon as the children were safely on the street, the sun would come out, bright as summer. Every morning when Maida woke up, she would say to herself, "I wonder how Mr. Chumpley is today." Then she would run over to the window to see. Mr. Chumpley had become a great favorite in the neighborhood. He was so tall that his round, happy face with its eternal orange peel grin could look straight over the fence to the street. The passers-by used to stop, paralyzed by the vision. But after studying the phenomenon, they would go laughing on their way. Occasionally a bad boy would shy a snowball at the smiling countenance, but Mr. Chumpley was so hard-headed that nothing seemed to hurt him. In the course of time the stovepipe became very battered, and as the result of continued storms, one eye sank down to the middle of his cheek. But in spite of these injuries, he continued to maintain his genial grin. "Let's go out and fix Mr. Chumpley," Rosie would say every day. The 2 little girls would brush the snow off his coat and hat, adjust his nose and teeth, would straighten him up generally. After a while, Maida threw her bird crumbs all over Mr. Chumpley. Thereafter the saucy little English sparrows ate from Mr. Chumpley's hat brim, his pipe bowl, even his pockets. "Perhaps the snow will last all winter," Maida said hopefully one day. "If it does, Mr. Chumpley's health will be perfect." "Well, perhaps it's just as well if he goes," Rosie said sensibly. "We haven't done a bit of work since he came." On Sunday, the weather moderated a little. Mr. Chumpley bore a most melancholy look all the afternoon, as if he feared what was to come. What was worse, he lost his nose. Monday morning, Maida ran to the window, dreading what she might see. But instead of the thaw she expected, a most beautiful sight spread out before her. The weather had turned cold in the night. Everything that had started to melt had frozen up again. The sidewalks were like frosted cakes. Long icicles made pretty fringes around the roofs of the houses. The trees and bushes were glazed by a sheathing of crystal. The sunlight played through all this, turning the world into a heap of diamonds. Mr. Chumpley had perked up under the influence of the cold. His manner had gained in solidity, although his gaze was a little glassy. Hopefully, Maida hunted about until she found his nose. She replaced his old set with some new orange peel teeth, and stuck his pipe between them. He looked quite himself. But alas, the sun came out and melted the whole world. The sidewalks trickled streams. The icicles dripped away in showers of diamonds. The trees lost their crystal sheathing. In the afternoon, Mr. Chumpley began to droop. By night, his head was resting disconsolately on his own shoulder. When Maida looked out the next morning, there was nothing in the corner but a mound of snow. An old coat lay to one side. Strewn about were a hat, a pair of gloves, a pipe, and a cane. Mr. Chumpley had passed away in the night. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to Maida's Little Shop. You can find a link to our podcast on the Marshall Public Library webpage, www.marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.